If you're in a leadership position around uh, the compliance and regulatory risk management in your organization, then pay close attention. I'm going to reveal to you a common solution that is used in organizations that actually causes failure and problems and can increase your risk. Now, why are we going to talk about this? Well, it's important that we solve problems using logic rather than corporate pressure and politics. I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations. If you're in a leadership position, you have to avoid this simple mistake where individuals often try to solve problems inside of an organization and they actually make the problem worse. So let me give you an example. There's a big problem your organization is facing. It's costing you millions of dollars a year. And rather than solving the problem, the solutions that are coming up include improving the platform that tracks the problem, changing the software you use to address the problem, or ultimately some other tangential element. Now, everybody feels great because it's a new initiative. It feels like something is happening, but in reality, there is no real progress towards a solution. And let me tell you why. The reason is without addressing the problem, first looking at the root cause and a clear definition of the problem. Now, those two things work together. If you don't have a clear definition, it's difficult to determine root cause. If you have a clear definition and a poor root cause, then you will be applying resources and effort towards a solution that just doesn't work. And I see this over and over again in corporations where the solution is more a different approach rather than an actual testable process oriented solution. So, for example, records retention is necessary to evidence a compliance activity or create evidence to validate controls and issues inside of an organization. Those records, if they're not properly coded, if they're not easy to recall, if they don't contain the right information, if they don't have a format that's consistent, then all of these things will contribute to an auditor rating your problem higher than it may actually be. And even worse, finding problems that are ongoing in your organization. Now, every large organization has problems that are on and off that are there, but these problems are not tied to tools. It doesn't matter what system you're tracking these things in if you don't have those key elements I described, such as the proper coding. So, record retention coding will talk about how long do you keep the information, what's its categorization, where it could be stored in the environment, all these factors. The root cause analysis to solve a problem you might have with records retention. So, for example, an auditor comes along and says, show me X, and you can't find X, or it doesn't exist. It's not in your system. You don't know if X was created and lost or if it was never created. That is a concept that changing your records retention tracking platform is not going to solve, because if the data is never put into the platform, you're just going to run into the problem again in the future. So the first thing we want to talk about is identifying the scale of the problem. So we're talking about $1 million problems. One of the things that I do is solve $1 million plus problems. There's no use putting my experience or my resources on a problem that isn't worth $1 million, because it's, first off, in a large corporation, the little stuff usually takes care of itself. But in this case, we have $1 million problem. Records are not being retained in a reasonable fashion. Now we know how to teach the concepts around record retention. What I'm showing you here is how to bridge a solution built on the methodology. So let's get into the specifics. And of course, we're not going to solve records retention here. This is an example of how we often change the cosmetics rather than finding the problem and then building out a root cause and then a clear plan. So let's define the problem. Auditors ask for documents that we can't recall. So the document could exist, maybe the document doesn't exist, but when the auditor asks for it, we can't recover it. So we don't want to ask, it's not a search issue. We want to ask about document creation. Now, this is a little bit of a tangential way of looking at the problem, but the problem isn't that we can't recall the document right now. That's just part of the problem. The larger problem is that there was a regulatorily required document that may or may not have been created, that should have been created, that wasn't where it was supposed to be when it was time to recall it. This is a process problem. This is deep in the process where the control activity happened. They didn't have a proper artifact to evidence the activity. So we need to address the question of the auditor, not the question of the record retention. Because a lot of things could have gone wrong. The record could have been created, but it was disposed of before it was supposed to be disposed of. It could have been improperly categorized, and so it was created, and they didn't know they had to retain it for a certain period of time. The document could have been created but stored someplace else outside of the system of record and was difficult to recover. It could have been created. It could have been stored in the proper system of record, but when you pulled it out of the system, it didn't look anything like the document you needed. All of these things are symptoms of the underlying problem that we must address before we change the platform, before we add a different service group, before we come in with a new process and innovative approach. The problem isn't that the document wasn't able to be easily recovered. That's a very small part of the larger problem. We've got to find a solution that adds to the value of the overall process. And in order to do that, we have to understand the overall process. In risk management, and why I'm speaking specifically to risk management professionals, we have processes, controls, we have laws, rules, and regulations, we have risks that we're accepting. And the foundation of the records retention problem in this particular example is a clear process where artifacts are created at control points. Those artifacts are properly categorized and handled. They are of a specific format. So we have the document definition. They are tied specifically to the laws, rules, and regs or the risks accepted. Now, if we have risks accepted, so we have these laws, rules, and regs that are formed into risks or policy, we need to have defined in those policies or in that risk acceptance statement the definition of what we should expect to retain. So these are really checks and balances that are going to make sure that first we have the correct document and we know the characteristics of that document. Then we can store it pretty much anywhere and it would be easy to recall. So storage is primarily some kind of repository and some kind of index so that we can recall what we put into the repository. From there, we have requirements that can then go into a system. And we'll very often find that any record retention system works well if it can enforce the category rules. So the classification of the document has retention rules. Can the system retain that? Now, it feels like we're doing something, again, changing the system. But if the system was set up wrong, if the system does have enough user competence to use it, meaning the users haven't been trained, if the system has had failures because of the type of environment it's put in, these are going to continue into the new software because you didn't know they were problems in the first place. So how do we address this? Because again, it is a very complex environment when you've got $1 million problems. And I've seen environments with $100 million problems, $1 billion problems. What we do is we get this out of the abstract and we use workflow diagrams. We use SIPOC, which is going to show the inputs and outputs of a system. We have the risk register with clear definitions of what the risk is and what is the applicable laws, rules, regulations, or the applicable policy. We have policies that are well defined. This isn't something where you switch one or two things and suddenly you've solved the records retention problem, or you've solved the control quality problem, or the risk taxonomy problem. We map these things out. You can use spiderweb diagrams, you can use network flow diagrams, but we map these things out on paper, and then we tie that back to our compliance tools. So if there's a risk register and your business unit has accepted a risk, they're going to have some kind of rationale that signifies the acceptance. If they don't accept the risk, there's going to be some kind of rationale about why they did not accept the risk, or it depends on how you do it. You don't necessarily need a rationale, but you might have the acceptance of the risk being in the environment because you haven't controlled for the risk. Now, from there, we layer on our records retention, we layer on our compliance reporting, and we can then store these things in a place where they can be recalled. We want to be testing that early in the system. We want to test that early in our application. This is long before the problem that showed up. See, the problems work like layers in an onion. You can have a pea under the corner of your mattress and you can feel it through multiple layers, but you don't want to confuse the discomfort of laying on that pea with the mattress closest to you. So we're really starting at the creation of the artifact and the purpose of that artifact, and then we're layering around that the other compliance elements. Now we want as few layers as possible, but ultimately for records management, records retention, for artifacts that might be used in a validation or an audit, these things have to be a natural part of the execution of both the process and the control. Because again, if the business users have to create something extra, they're not going to do it. If they have to create 5 pieces when one would do, the 5 pieces are going to get lost. They're going to get they're not going to be organized. Again, we are looking at the scale of the problem measured in count. And so sometimes people say, well, we have to change the system because the volume of transactions are too high. Well, is that the right volume of transactions? Are we scaling this correctly? Now, a little bit of what I'm sharing here is going to help you choose the right software package or choose the right solution in the long run because you're going to better understand the problem. But again, it boils down to clear definition of the problem. What is the root cause of this problem? And then a plan for action. That clear definition, again, has to be at the lowest level that has the most impact. It has to be focused on the smooth execution so that it actually has performance compliance, and then ultimately must build out to the things that we see on the surface. So again, I know this is a complex topic. That's why we draw it out on a whiteboard. We might do a Venn diagram and we have what the overlapping factors are that impact the outcome that we're looking for. The problem we found was when audit asked for something, they couldn't find it. We narrowed it down to records retention. But what's the other side of that? How do the records get into the system? For every record that's in your system, there's probably hundreds of records that are not actually in your system, or they're out of date, or they're incomplete, or they're not properly formatted. See, getting those things straight is what is the foundation of having good information in the system so that when an auditor comes along. But again, we don't have a lot of time to cover these topics in a podcast. If you have specific questions about risk management, specific questions about addressing these complex problems, we can talk about things about how to diagram, how to lay out these concepts, how to break out into working groups so that we can do a challenge and response, and how to stop making these knee-jerk reactions that, oh, if we just had a different group doing the work, if we just had a different software system, if we just had a new law or a new policy. Those are addressing symptoms, and they don't clearly address the systematic problem or the inherent problem in the design of the work that you're doing. If you don't build from the process through the controls, making those ties to risks and regulations, you will fail with this new problem. And what you'll find out is in a few years, and I don't know if you've seen this, but every few years there's a reorg. Every few years there's a new approach to RCSA. Every few years there's a new approach to how we're doing major requirements, and then we rewrite the policy. Again, that is distraction, and you solve that by drilling down problem, root cause, clear plan, and then challenging that against a little bit of human behavior and so on. I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations. If you have questions about what I've covered today, visit me at www.insidestrategicrelations.com. Go to the contact page and ask your questions. This topic could be a 3-day seminar. where we talk about, we diagram, and we show you. But again, what my key point is, the takeaway is that quick fix, it might seem like an eloquent solution. It might be a way to consolidate power if you're in the leadership position. It may be what feels like it's right, but until you have these artifacts in place, until you have the diagrams, the mappings, the measures in place, you really don't know that you're solving a problem. You might actually be creating more problems. I want to thank you for listening. This is the Inside Strategic Relations podcast, and I'll see you in the next episode.